there are mysteries that announce themselves with violence. A scream in the night, a shattered window, a body discovered before dawn. Blackwood Manor offered none of these. Its mystery began with something far quieter. A letter, written by an old friend whose judgment I had trusted for many years. A gentleman who did not frighten easily. Yet in that letter he confessed that someone beneath his own roof wished him harm. Before the following night had ended, I would find broken glass upon the stone floor, fresh mud where no mud ought to have been, the lingering fragrance of Turkish tobacco, and enough quiet observations to convince me that appearances inside Blackwood Manor were dangerously deceptive. But all of that lay ahead. The story truly began on an ordinary rainy evening, when 3 measured knocks sounded upon my cottage door. The rain had begun before dusk, and, by the time the village lamps had dissolved into pale amber halos beyond my garden hedge, it had settled into the sort of patient, unwavering rhythm that belongs only to the English countryside. It did not rage against the cottage windows, nor fling itself with theatrical indignation upon the panes. Instead, it whispered, it tapped with gentle persistence, as though the weather itself wished to be admitted to the warmth within, content merely to remind me that the world beyond my little sitting room had become silver, sodden, and wonderfully distant. There is, I have always believed, a peculiar comfort in listening to rain when one has no obligation to venture into it. The drops traced delicate paths across the old leaded glass, blurring the outline of the garden gate until it seemed a sketch rendered in watercolor. Every now and then a faint gust persuaded the ivy to brush softly against the stone wall, producing a dry rustle beneath the endless murmur of the storm. Within, however, another music prevailed. The hearth crackled with cheerful determination, each glowing log surrendering itself in tiny sighs of amber and crimson. Occasionally a knot in the wood would yield with a modest pop, sending a brief fountain of sparks dancing behind the iron grate before settling once more into the comforting glow. The scent of seasoned oak mingled pleasantly with the fragrance of polished furniture and old books, both of which had absorbed decades of quiet evenings much like this one. My Earl Grey rested upon the small mahogany table beside my chair, its porcelain cup releasing elegant ribbons of steam that carried the unmistakable perfume of bergamot. I wrapped both hands around it, allowing the warmth to settle into fingers that had grown rather cool despite the fire. One sip revealed precisely what I had hoped for, neither too strong nor too delicate, balanced with the sort of reassuring familiarity that one appreciates increasingly with age. The wireless sat silently upon its shelf. Earlier in the afternoon it had supplied a concert of respectable strings, and an earnest weather report that had predicted exactly what now unfolded beyond the windows. I had elected not to switch it on again. Silence, when accompanied by rain and a lively fire, possesses a conversation all its own. My slippers rested comfortably upon the faded hearthrug, while my trousers bore the faintest crease of a day spent more in reflection than in activity. The cottage itself seemed to breathe around me, every timber acquainted with the habits of its solitary occupant. The grandfather clock in the corner maintained its solemn duty with deliberate precision, each measured tick serving not as a reminder of time's passage, but rather as permission to linger a little longer within the evening's embrace. It was precisely the sort of night upon which memories become unusually willing companions. There are those who imagine that a detective's occupation consists chiefly of dramatic revelations, hurried pursuits through darkened lanes, or clever speeches delivered in drawing rooms crowded with astonished suspects. Such notions are encouraged by newspapers, whose affection for sensation has never been matched by an equal fondness for truth. The genuine labor of solving mysteries is conducted elsewhere. It occurs during long, uneventful evenings when one sits quietly beside a fire, examining not footprints or fingerprints but recollections. Facts are remarkably obedient creatures when first encountered. It is memory that insists upon rearranging them. The case that occupied my thoughts that evening had concluded some 3 weeks before, yet it refused to depart with proper manners. Indeed, its principal puzzle had been resolved satisfactorily enough. Justice, insofar as our imperfect world permits such a thing, had been served. Even so, certain expressions lingered in my mind with greater persistence than the evidence itself. I recalled a gentleman's hesitation before answering what appeared to be an innocent question. I remembered a lady adjusting her gloves, despite having already removed them moments earlier. There had been a gardener who spoke of roses while looking steadfastly at the gravel path, and a curate whose silence had proved infinitely more eloquent than another man's lengthy explanation. It is astonishing how often guilt resides not in words, but in their absence. I found myself wondering whether experience sharpens one's perception or merely encourages suspicion. There is, after all, a subtle distinction between wisdom and habit. One begins by noticing unusual behavior. Eventually, one notices ordinary behavior with equal interest. My tea had cooled somewhat, though it remained agreeable. Beyond the window, the rain continued its patient recital, accompanied now and then by the faint complaint of branches swaying beneath the weight of the weather. Somewhere farther across the village came the muted growl of a motorcar laboring through flooded lanes before its engine disappeared once more into the velvet darkness. The fire settled lower, inviting another log, which I obliged with the poker. Fresh flames climbed eagerly upward, throwing warm light across the rows of books that lined the opposite wall. Their worn bindings seemed almost companionable in the shifting glow, each volume preserving another quiet conversation from another age. There was no reason to expect interruption. No appointment had been arranged. No telegram had arrived. The hour itself discouraged visitors possessed of ordinary courtesy. And yet, just as I lifted the cup for another thoughtful sip, 3 measured knocks sounded upon the cottage door, firm enough to be heard above the rain. I did not rise at once. The sound lingered in the room long after the final rap had faded into the patient murmur of the rain, as though the cottage itself had taken notice and was waiting, with quiet curiosity, to discover whether I intended to answer. My cup remained poised for a moment in my hand. Then, with deliberate care, I placed it upon the polished mahogany table. The porcelain met the wood with the gentlest of clicks, a modest punctuation that somehow seemed louder now that the evening's solitude had been interrupted. The chair sighed as I stood. Its familiar complaint was answered immediately by the old floorboards beneath my feet. They possessed their own curious geography of creaks and murmurs, every plank long acquainted with my habits. One announced my first step with a dry, measured groan. Another remained perfectly silent, while a third answered with a faint protest that traveled somewhere beneath the hearthrug before disappearing into the timbers below. The fire continued its quiet industry behind me. Its light reached into the hallway in wavering bands of amber, setting the framed landscapes upon the walls into gentle motion. Shadows lengthened and withdrew with each restless flicker of the flames, so that familiar objects acquired for an instant the appearance of strangers before settling once more into recognition. The brass umbrella stand gleamed briefly. My coat upon its peg seemed almost to incline its shoulders. As I drew nearer the entrance, the warmth of the sitting room diminished by imperceptible degrees. A cool thread of air slipped beneath the heavy oak door and drifted across my shoes. It carried with it the unmistakable scent of wet earth, rain-soaked hedgerows, and the clean mineral fragrance that accompanies a thoroughly drenched evening. The contrast only heightened my appreciation for the fire behind me. My hand had not yet reached the latch, for my thoughts had become occupied by those 3 measured knocks. Not hurried, not timid. There had been neither the impatient pounding of a tradesman, nor the uncertain tapping of a neighbor apologizing for a late disturbance. The cadence had possessed restraint, almost discipline. 3 evenly spaced blows, each delivered with sufficient firmness to ensure they were heard, yet without any trace of alarm. A messenger, perhaps. Someone carrying another person's business rather than his own. There are occasions when urgency shouts. There are others when it speaks quietly, trusting that its importance will be recognized without theatrical display. These knocks belonged decidedly to the latter. I rested my fingers upon the cool iron latch. The metal had surrendered its warmth to the night, and for a brief instant I could feel the weather waiting on the opposite side of the timber. Drawing back the bolt, I opened the door. The rain breathed immediately into the hall. Upon the threshold stood a solitary figure, coat glistening beneath the porch lantern, water streaming steadily from the brim of a well-worn hat. Every fold of the traveler's clothing had surrendered to the storm, and a faint shiver passed through their frame, despite an evident effort to remain composed. One gloved hand clutched a sealed envelope, its heavy cream paper protected beneath the lapel, as carefully as though it were of greater consequence than comfort itself. Beyond the visitor, the lane disappeared into darkness, while somewhere in that rain-veiled distance, the outline of a grand manor house waited unseen. The messenger inclined their head with quiet respect and extended the envelope. "It comes," they said softly, "from the house at the end of the lane." The messenger accepted my thanks with a courteous inclination of the head. "I'm obliged to you, sir," I said. "You have chosen a disagreeable night for such an errand. It was thought best that the letter reach you without delay." There was nothing theatrical in the reply. Indeed, it was delivered with the quiet economy of one accustomed to carrying other people's concerns across muddy lanes and indifferent weather. When I suggested, as good manners required, that a place by the fire and a fresh cup of tea might be welcome, the offer was met with a gentle shake of the head. I must be on my way. No further explanation followed. Within another moment the figure had descended the worn stone step and dissolved into the silver curtain of rain. The lantern above my porch caught the gleam of wet shoulders for an instant before the darkness reclaimed them entirely. Soon there remained only the patient whisper of the storm, and the faint impression of footsteps softened almost immediately by water. I stood listening until even that suggestion of company had vanished. Then I drew the heavy oak door closed. Its weight settled reassuringly into the frame with a deep wooden note that seemed to belong to the cottage as naturally as the ticking of the old clock. I lifted the iron bolt, guiding it carefully across its worn channel until it found its place with a solid metallic certainty. The little draught that had accompanied the open doorway surrendered at once, and the warmth of the house gathered itself again around me like a familiar blanket. Only then did I look properly at the envelope. It rested comfortably in my hand, heavier than ordinary correspondence. The cream paper possessed a pleasing stiffness, neither glossy nor coarse, but carrying the faint grain that speaks of careful workmanship. Its edges were neatly cut, and despite its journey through the storm, it remained almost perfectly dry. Whoever had entrusted it to the messenger had taken evident precautions against the weather. As I crossed the hallway, the floorboards resumed their quiet conversation beneath my steps. Their gentle creaks seemed somehow friendlier now that the interruption had passed. Firelight stretched before me across the polished boards, wavering softly with every movement of the flames behind the grate. The envelope caught that amber glow as I entered the sitting room. Upon its reverse shone a generous seal of deep burgundy wax, rich enough in color to resemble dark claret in the firelight. Pressed firmly into its center was the impression of an ancient crest, a spreading oak above 3 small stars, surrounded by a narrow ring of ivy leaves. Though time had blurred the finer details, I recognized the device almost immediately. Blackwood Manor. I paused beside the mantelpiece before reclaiming my chair. There is little wisdom in opening an unexpected letter hastily. A sealed envelope preserves possibilities. Once broken, it yields only facts, and facts have a way of altering the complexion of an evening. My silver paper knife rested where it always had, upon the corner of the writing desk. Its handle, polished smooth by many years of use, reflected the fire in slender ribbons of light. I picked it up, settled once more into the welcoming embrace of the armchair, and laid the envelope across my knee. The blade slipped beneath the folded edge, with scarcely a whisper. There was no tearing, no impatient movement. The wax yielded cleanly, separating with a neat crack that sounded surprisingly distinct in the quiet room. A faint fragrance rose from the paper, not perfume exactly, but the dry scent of old libraries, cedar drawers, and writing desks that have known generations of careful correspondence. I withdrew the folded sheets. The handwriting was instantly familiar, firm, elegant, and remarkably even despite what I suspected had not been an entirely tranquil state of mind. Without quite intending to do so, I found myself reading the words aloud. "My dear friend, it has been far too many years since we last enjoyed. Little has altered here, save the disposition of those presently beneath its roof. I have gathered a small party of guests, each arriving for reasons that appeared entirely respectable. Yet, since their arrival, an unease has settled upon the household that neither reason nor routine has succeeded in dispelling. There have been conversations that cease upon my entering a room. Doors I distinctly recall locking have been discovered, standing open. A cherished possession has vanished only to reappear when no sensible person could have placed it. Such incidents may each admit an innocent explanation. Taken together, they do not. My servants insist that I have become fanciful. I should like very much to believe them. Yet I cannot rid myself of the conviction that someone beneath this roof intends me serious harm. If your affairs permit, I ask that you come tomorrow without announcing the true purpose of your visit. Allow my guests to suppose you have accepted nothing more than the hospitality of an old acquaintance. Should I prove mistaken, I shall endure your gentle laughter with gratitude. Should I prove correct, I fear time may be shorter than either of us imagines. Yours, with every confidence, Edmund Blackwood. The final line hung in the quiet room long after I had spoken it. Outside, the rain continued its steady conversation with the cottage windows, while the fire answered with a low, thoughtful crackle. I folded the letter once more, though more carefully than before, and looked into the glowing coals, where every ordinary evening has a curious way of coming to an end. For several moments after the final words had left my lips, I remained perfectly still. The folded letter rested lightly between my fingers, while the fire continued its patient conversation with the grate. Outside, the rain neither strengthened nor diminished. It possessed that remarkable constancy which belongs only to nights that seem determined to continue forever, measuring the passing hours not by violence, but by persistence. At length I lowered the pages to my lap. My gaze drifted, almost without conscious intention, toward the waistcoat pocket in which my watch habitually rested. The familiar chain caught the firelight as I drew it free, each tiny silver link glimmering briefly before disappearing once more into shadow. The watch itself had accompanied me through more years than I cared to number. Its polished case bore the faintest evidence of long acquaintance with careful hands, while the engraved initials upon its reverse had softened beneath decades of gentle handling. I pressed the little catch with my thumb. The lid sprang open with a delicate click. The white enamel face reflected the glow of the hearth, and the slender black hands stood in perfect alignment. Midnight. For a curious instant, the room seemed even quieter than before. The grandfather clock, perhaps offended by being anticipated, waited another few heartbeats before announcing the hour in 12 slow, dignified chimes. Each measured note wandered through the cottage, lingering among the rafters before fading gently into the steady whisper of the rain. When the final vibration had dissolved into silence, I closed the watch. There are occasions when prudence recommends waiting until daylight. There are others when delay itself becomes an unnecessary risk. Edmund Blackwood had requested that I arrive upon the morrow. Had circumstances been ordinary, I should almost certainly have honored that arrangement. Yet there had been something in the character of his letter which resisted comfortable explanation. It was not merely the incidents he described, unsettling though they undoubtedly were. It was the manner in which he had described them. Edmund had always possessed a temperament inclined toward moderation. During the years of our friendship, I had known him to face financial disappointments, family disagreements, and even personal bereavement with a composure bordering upon stubbornness. He did not alarm easily. For such a man to confess that he feared someone beneath his own roof intended him serious harm, no. Morning suddenly seemed a remarkably long distance away. I rose quietly from my chair. The room welcomed movement reluctantly, as though reluctant to surrender the peace it had so carefully preserved throughout the evening. The fire cast broad amber bands across the hearthrug, while shadows shifted lazily along the bookshelves as I crossed toward the grate. There remained sufficient fuel to burn until dawn if left unattended. Nevertheless, cottages appreciate consideration. I reached for the old iron poker. Its handle felt reassuringly familiar within my hand, smooth in those places where years of use had polished away every roughness. The lower length remained cool despite its proximity to the flames, though the tip acquired warmth almost immediately as I introduced it among the glowing embers. Very gently, I persuaded the burning logs closer together. The coals answered with quiet sighs of crimson and gold, collapsing inward in tiny avalanches that released delicate fountains of sparks behind the protective grate. A ribbon of pale ash floated upward before disappearing into the chimney. There is an oddly satisfying occupation in preparing a fire for one's absence. One does not extinguish it entirely. Instead, one encourages it toward patience. I drew the heavier logs nearer the heart of the embers, allowing the accumulated warmth to sustain itself gradually through the remaining hours of darkness. The flames settled lower, becoming less eager but no less determined, exchanging lively brightness for enduring comfort. Satisfied, I rested the poker once more upon its brass stand. Its familiar ring against the stone hearth sounded almost ceremonial. The cottage had been made ready. Only then did I turn toward the hallway. My overcoat hung exactly where I had left it earlier that afternoon. It was fashioned from thick charcoal wool, substantial enough to discourage all but the most determined weather. As I lifted it from the polished oak peg, its considerable weight settled comfortably across my forearms. The fabric retained the faint fragrance of cedar from the wardrobe, in which it ordinarily spent the warmer months, mingled now with the clean scent of brushed wool. I slipped one arm into the sleeve, then the other. The lining accepted my jacket with scarcely any resistance, while the broad collar settled naturally about my neck. One by one I fastened the large horn buttons, each passing through its corresponding buttonhole with quiet certainty. The coat seemed almost to possess a reassuring gravity of its own. Rain, after all, is far less disagreeable when one is properly dressed for it. Beside the hall table stood a narrow drawer. Within it rested an object I seldom found occasion to carry. The revolver lay precisely where I had placed it many months before. Its modest proportions rendered it easily concealed, while its blued steel had surrendered much of its warmth to the cool night air. When I lifted it, the metal felt distinctly cold against my palm, possessing that unmistakable density unique to carefully machined steel. Weapons have never inspired confidence merely by existing. Their reassurance lies instead in certainty. I opened the cylinder. Its movement remained beautifully precise. One by one I examined the chambers beneath the lantern light, more from habit than expectation. Each cartridge sat properly seated, its polished brass reflecting tiny crescents of amber. Everything was exactly as it should be. I closed the cylinder with a gentle movement, resisting any temptation toward unnecessary flourish, and slipped the revolver into the deep pocket of my overcoat. Its weight proved scarcely noticeable. I hoped sincerely that it would remain so. I crossed quietly to the wardrobe that stood beside the staircase, its oak panels darkened by generations of careful polishing. Opening the door released the faint fragrance of cedar, clean linen, and the dry, reassuring scent of well-kept wood. Upon the lower shelf rested a small leather valise, its brown surface softened by years of faithful service, the corners gently worn, and the brass catches bearing the mellow glow that only frequent handling bestows. I lifted it free, finding its familiar weight immediately comforting. There was no occasion to burden oneself with unnecessary possessions. A clean change of linen was folded with deliberate care and laid neatly within. Beside it I placed my leather-bound notebook, whose pages had preserved many observations that memory alone might eventually have betrayed. A fresh bottle of black ink followed, wrapped for caution in a folded handkerchief. And finally my heavy pocket magnifying glass, its silver rim catching a quiet ribbon of firelight, before settling among the other necessities, with the softest suggestion of a clink. Satisfied that nothing essential had been overlooked, I closed the lid and secured the brass catches, whose gentle clicks sounded unexpectedly companionable in the sleeping cottage. A hat, a pair of leather gloves, and my walking stick completed the preparations. For a final moment I allowed my eyes to travel slowly around the hallway. The umbrella stand, the framed landscapes, the polished staircase disappearing into darkness above. Every familiar object appeared quietly content to await my return. Whenever that might be, I extinguished the hallway lamp. Immediately the cottage surrendered itself almost entirely to the softened glow, escaping from the sitting room behind me. Crossing the threshold I opened the heavy oak door. The rain greeted me at once. Cool, clean air drifted inward, carrying the rich fragrance of wet earth, soaked moss, and sleeping hedgerows. Somewhere beyond the porch, invisible in the darkness, water trickled steadily along the edges of the lane. I stepped outside. The door swung closed behind me, with its familiar, satisfying weight. Drawing the iron key from my pocket, I inserted it into the well-worn lock. The mechanism turned smoothly. A firm click answered. I tested the handle once. the cottage remained secure against the night. For reasons difficult to explain, I experienced a curious comfort in that small certainty. My motorcar waited beneath the shelter of a modest timber lean-to beside the garden wall. Even in darkness I recognized its reassuring outline. Rain beaded upon the curved bonnet in countless tiny pearls that caught what little light escaped from the cottage windows before sliding quietly into the gravel below. I settled myself behind the wheel. Before reaching for the controls, I placed the little leather valise carefully upon the passenger seat beside me, where it rested securely against the smooth leather cushion, as though it too had accompanied me upon many such journeys. Only then did my gloved hands tighten gently around the steering wheel as I adjusted the choke and pressed the starter. For a brief moment there came only the patient ticking of rain upon the roof. Then the engine stirred. Once. Twice. Finally it awakened altogether with a deep, even murmur that seemed less like machinery than some contented creature clearing its throat before beginning a journey. The vibration traveled softly through the floorboards beneath my shoes. It was an unexpectedly comforting sensation. The headlamp sprang to life. 2 warm circles of yellow light reached cautiously into the darkness ahead, illuminating drifting curtains of mist that appeared almost solid before dissolving again into the night. Beyond their reach the countryside remained entirely hidden, as though the world itself existed only where the beams happened to fall. I released the brake. Very gradually the motorcar rolled onto the narrow lane. The tires whispered through shallow water collected between the ruts, sending delicate fans of silver outward into the hedgerows. Every puddle reflected the headlamps for an instant before breaking apart beneath the passing wheels. Soon the cottage had vanished behind me. Only the road remained. The fog thickened as I left the shelter of the village. It gathered lazily across the fields, drifting over stone walls and sleeping meadows, until trees appeared without warning, lingered beside the motorcar for several moments, then quietly disappeared once more into whiteness. The windscreen wipers commenced their patient labor. Click, clack, click, clack. Their measured rhythm became wonderfully hypnotic. Each sweep gathered away the fine veil of rain only for another to replace it almost immediately. The glass cleared for a heartbeat, revealing shining hedges, flooded ditches, and occasional wooden gates before surrendering once more to shimmering droplets. The engine maintained its steady drone beneath it all, not hurried, not strained, merely constant. There are few companions more dependable upon a lonely night than the quiet persistence of a well-kept motor car. My thoughts, however, proved rather less steady. Again and again they returned to Edmund. I pictured him somewhere beyond the darkness, perhaps seated before a fire not unlike my own, listening to the same rain striking ancient windows. Had he retired for the evening? Or was he, even now, awake within the long galleries of Blackwood Manor, wondering whether every creak of old timber announced nothing more sinister than age, or the careful approach of someone who wished him harm? The letter had spoken of vanished possessions, unlocked doors, interrupted conversations, small disturbances which, taken separately, might easily have invited laughter. Together they formed something altogether different. Experience had taught me that genuine danger rarely announces itself dramatically. Far more often it enters quietly, wearing the comfortable disguise of coincidence until at last, one coincidence too many renders the disguise impossible to maintain. The lane curved gently between towering elms, their branches met overhead, forming a dark cathedral through which my headlamps wandered in muted gold. Rainwater descended steadily from countless leaves, striking the bonnet with soft, irregular taps that blended naturally with the endless rhythm of the wipers. Click, clack, click, clack. Somewhere in the unseen distance, an owl called once, before surrendering the countryside once more to silence. I drove onward into the patient darkness, the warm circles of lamplight advancing only a few yards beyond the bonnet, while Blackwood Manor waited, still unseen, somewhere beyond the rain and the fog. The lane, which until now had seemed content to guide me between hedgerows and sleeping fields, gradually surrendered its modest character to something altogether older. The hedges grew taller, the stone walls broader. Ancient oaks, their branches bowed beneath the weight of rain, leaned inward until they formed dark arches over the road. My headlamps wandered patiently across dripping trunks mottled with silver lichen, revealing glimpses of moss-covered boundary stones, before allowing them to disappear once more into the surrounding darkness. The engine maintained its steady murmur. The windscreen wipers continued their familiar refrain. Click, clack. Click, clack. Presently, through the drifting mist, two pale shapes began to emerge. At first, they appeared little more than vague suggestions rising from the rain. Gradually, they acquired substance. Stone pillars. Massive. Patient. Each bore upon its summit a weathered heraldic beast carved from the same grey stone, its features softened by generations of wind and weather. Though rain had blurred the finer details, I recognized the creatures from the wax seal that had closed Edmund's letter. Great lions, or creatures very nearly resembling lions, sat with solemn dignity upon their haunches, their broad paws resting upon shields now softened almost beyond recognition by the passing decades. Moss gathered generously about their manes, while ivy climbed patiently around the bases of the pillars, as though nature herself had undertaken the responsibility of preserving them. Between those silent guardians rested the gates of Blackwood Manor. Heavy iron. Black with age. Every upright bar terminated in a spearpoint glistening faintly beneath the rain, while intricate scrollwork spread between them in patterns now partly concealed beneath rust and climbing ivy. The gates remained firmly closed. I brought the motorcar gently to a halt. For a moment I remained seated, listening. Rain drummed softly upon the roof. The engine idled with quiet contentment. Somewhere beyond the gates water trickled unseen through unseen channels beneath the gravel drive. There seemed no alternative. Drawing on my gloves once more, I opened the door. The rain welcomed me immediately. It settled upon the brim of my hat with soft insistence, while cool droplets gathered upon the shoulders of my overcoat. My boots descended into wet gravel with a muted crunch before finding firmer footing upon the stone approach. The iron latch had been fixed to one of the pillars many years before. Its surface, roughened by rust and polished smooth only where countless hands had grasped it, yielded reluctantly beneath my gloved fingers. I pulled. For an instant, nothing happened. Then, somewhere deep within the ancient mechanism, hidden bolts stirred from a sleep that seemed almost geological in duration. The hinges answered. Their slow complaint rolled through the darkness with a long, melancholy groan that echoed faintly among the trees before dissolving into the endless murmur of the rain. Very gradually, the great gates surrendered their vigil. They moved only as much as necessity required. I guided one inward with measured pressure until there remained sufficient space for the motorcar to pass. Returning to the driver's seat brought immediate relief from the weather. The familiar scent of polished leather, engine oil and rain-damp wool gathered quietly around me as I eased the motorcar through the narrow opening. Once beyond, I stopped briefly to close the gate once more, hearing the heavy iron settle back into place with a deep metallic certainty that seemed to separate the world outside from the estate beyond. Only then did I continue. The driveway curved gently away into darkness. Its gravel surface shone beneath the headlamps, every rain-soaked stone reflecting tiny points of golden light before disappearing beneath the steady progress of the motorcar. Pools of collected water rested within shallow depressions, their smooth surfaces disturbed only by the gentle ripple of falling rain as my tires approached and passed. On either side stood yew trees of extraordinary age. Their branches reached across the drive until they met overhead, weaving together a somber green canopy that admitted scarcely any light from the hidden sky. The rain filtered through their dense foliage in slow, patient drops that fell at irregular intervals upon the bonnet, each soft tap joining the steady rhythm of the storm. The world beyond the headlamps appeared to have dissolved entirely. There remained only a narrow ribbon of illuminated gravel extending a short distance before me, vanishing abruptly into velvet darkness. It was rather like navigating through memory itself, each yard revealing only enough of the road to encourage another. The wipers continued faithfully. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. Here and there the beams discovered fragments of the estate, a weathered stone urn overflowing with rainwater, the broken outline of a marble sundial standing quietly among neglected shrubs, a wrought iron bench whose empty seat glistened beneath the weather like polished ebony. Each appeared unexpectedly, accompanied me for a few brief seconds, then drifted quietly behind into darkness once more. The driveway bent again. Quite suddenly the manor revealed itself. Not entirely. Only gradually. At first I perceived nothing more than a darker darkness beyond the rain. Then angles emerged. A high gable. A line of chimneys. The broad suggestion of many roofs descending one beyond another. With every careful yard the house acquired greater substance until Blackwood Manor stood before me in all its solemn immensity. It was a building that belonged less to architecture than to endurance. Constructed of dark stone now blackened by centuries of weather, it rose from the surrounding landscape with quiet authority. Ivy clothed much of its outer walls, while tall, mullioned windows reflected almost none of the light that reached them. Most remained entirely dark. Only 2 windows high upon the eastern side offered the faintest glow of candlelight. Their warm amber radiance appeared wonderfully fragile against so vast a weight of stone. I found myself wondering whether one of those distant lights belonged to Edmund, or whether someone else remained wakeful beneath that ancient roof. The gravel widened into a broad turning circle before the entrance. Its center contained what had once been a handsome fountain, though the figure standing within it had become little more than a rain-darkened silhouette beneath curtains of ivy and moss. I drew the motorcar to a gentle halt beneath the shelter of the great portico. The engine fell gradually into silence. Its steady companionship vanished so gently that for several moments afterward, I fancied I could still hear its quiet murmur lingering somewhere beneath the sound of the rain. The stillness that followed possessed a curious depth. Rain fell steadily upon the slate roof overhead. Water descended from overflowing gutters in continuous silver threads beyond the shelter of the portico. Somewhere within the unseen gardens a branch creaked softly beneath the weight of the weather. I reached for my leather valise. Its worn handle settled comfortably into my gloved hand as I stepped from the motorcar onto the broad stone paving. The steps leading upward had been hollowed ever so slightly by generations of visitors, their smooth centers shining faintly, where the rain had polished the ancient stone. My boots produced quiet, damp echoes as I climbed. Above me the front door rose to an impressive height, fashioned from heavy oak, darkened almost to black with age. Iron straps crossed its broad surface in elegant patterns, while at its center hung a substantial door-knocker, cast in the form of one of the heraldic beasts I had seen upon the entrance pillars. Its iron felt bitterly cold. I lifted it, allowed it to fall. The sound traveled deeply through the house. Not loud, merely authoritative. It seemed to echo for a remarkably long while. Then there came silence once more. I waited. Presently I became aware of another sound. Footsteps. Measured. Unhurried. Approaching steadily from somewhere beyond the great door. A bolt withdrew. Then, another. Locks yielded one by one with quiet metallic certainty before the door itself opened inward by several inches. Warmth emerged immediately. Not the vigorous warmth of my own cottage fire, but the gentler comfort of a large house whose hearths had burned continuously throughout many generations. Framed within the doorway stood an elderly gentleman. He was tall, though advancing years had persuaded his shoulders into the slightest inclination. His black coat had plainly been tailored to an excellent standard many years earlier, and remained meticulously brushed, despite modest signs of faithful service. The white collar at his neck retained its crispness, while the cuffs showed the faintest suggestion of careful mending visible only to an observant eye. His silver hair lay perfectly arranged. His expression remained composed. Only the shadows beneath his eyes hinted that sleep had become a stranger. "Good evening, sir," he said quietly. His voice possessed that remarkable quality found only among experienced butlers, capable of conveying welcome without familiarity and concern without sacrificing composure. "I am Gibbons. I regret arriving at so unreasonable an hour. Sir Edmund anticipated that you might." He stepped aside. "If you would be so kind." I entered. The great door closed gently behind me, shutting out the weather until the rain became a softened murmur somewhere beyond thick stone walls. The entrance hall stretched upward into shadow. Its ceiling disappeared among dark oak beams scarcely touched by the light below. Portraits of solemn Blackwood ancestors regarded the room from carved panels. their gilded frames catching occasional glimmers from shaded wall lamps whose flames had been turned deliberately low. A great fireplace occupied the far wall. Its fire had settled into glowing embers, sending only occasional flickers across the polished floor. Near it stood an imposing grandfather clock. Its pendulum moved with quiet determination. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound filled the hall without ever disturbing its silence. Gibbons accepted my hat with careful hands. Then my overcoat. Finally, he relieved me of the leather valise, as though it contained something of considerably greater value than folded linen and writing materials. "I trust your journey was not excessively disagreeable, sir." "The roads required respect," I replied, "though the motorcar behaved admirably." "I am pleased to hear it." He lowered his voice almost instinctively. "The household has long since retired. Sir Edmund alone remains awake." There was the briefest pause. "He has spent the greater part of the evening in his study." No further explanation seemed necessary. Gibbons inclined his head toward a long, oak-paneled corridor, whose polished floor reflected the faint glow of distant lamps. "If you would accompany me, sir." I followed. Our footsteps echoed softly through the sleeping house. Somewhere above, hidden among the upper floors, old timbers answered the weather with quiet murmurs of their own. The rain whispered against tall windows. The grandfather clock continued faithfully behind us, its measured ticking growing fainter with every step. At length Gibbons stopped before a substantial oak door whose brass handle shone warmly in the subdued light. Balancing my valise carefully in one hand, he raised the other. Then, with quiet deliberation, he knocked gently upon the study door. Gibbons' knuckles had scarcely left the oak panel before a quiet voice answered from within. "Come." The single word reached us with surprising clarity despite its softness, as though the room beyond had been arranged expressly to preserve conversation, while excluding every unnecessary sound. Gibbons turned the polished brass handle. The heavy door yielded without complaint. Immediately I became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. The entrance hall behind me possessed the dignified spaciousness of a house intended to impress. Its high ceilings welcomed echoes, while every footstep found opportunity to announce itself among stone and oak. Sir Edmund's study seemed to prefer confidence to grandeur. Warmth greeted me first. Not the vigorous heat of a newly tended fire, but the deep, accumulated comfort of a room whose hearth had burned faithfully throughout the evening. The air carried the pleasant fragrance of seasoned wood, leather bindings, candle wax, and the faint lingering sweetness of pipe tobacco, absorbed over many quiet years into polished furniture. The storm had become wonderfully distant. Though I could still detect the rain beyond the walls, it reached the study only as a softened murmur, gently tapping against thick window panes hidden behind heavy velvet curtains of such deep green that they appeared almost black, except where the lamplight touched their folds. The room itself seemed fashioned almost entirely from mahogany. The broad writing desk, the carved bookcases, the mantel, the occasional table upon which rested a silver tray supporting a crystal decanter whose amber contents glowed warmly beneath the nearby lamp. Beside it stood two substantial glasses, each so perfectly polished that the candlelight wandered through them like liquid gold. Books surrounded the room on every side. Floor-to-ceiling shelves carried ranks of green leather bindings, relieved only occasionally by volumes of dark burgundy or brown. Their gilt lettering shimmered faintly whenever the flames shifted, lending the curious impression that the library itself breathed quietly in the firelight. Only one lamp had been lit upon the desk. Its green-shaded glass directed a generous pool of warm light across neatly arranged correspondence, while leaving the farther reaches of the room to comfortable shadow. 3 candles burned nearby in silver holders, their flames low and steady, lengthening familiar objects into gentle silhouettes that reached across the Persian carpet. The fire answered with an occasional quiet crackle. A log settled. Somewhere beneath the mantel clock, a tiny mechanism marked the passing seconds with almost apologetic discretion. Gibbons stepped aside. "Mr. has arrived, Sir Edmund." "Thank you, Gibbons." The butler inclined his head almost imperceptibly before withdrawing, closing the door behind him with such care that the latch scarcely made a sound. Only then did Sir Edmund rise. For a brief instant I saw not the anxious gentleman who had written the letter lying folded inside my coat, but the friend I had known many years before. He remained a tall man, his broad shoulders still suggesting the vigor that had once carried him confidently across hunting fields and parliamentary corridors alike. His hair, now almost entirely silver, had been brushed with habitual care, while his dark smoking jacket retained every indication of excellent tailoring. Yet anxiety leaves impressions no tailor can conceal. As he crossed the room toward me, I noticed that one hand trembled ever so slightly before becoming still again. Not continuously, only for a moment. His step remained measured, but it lacked the easy assurance I remembered. There was a certain caution in it now, as though some invisible burden had persuaded him to distribute his weight more thoughtfully than before. Most striking of all were his eyes. They met mine warmly enough, yet they refused to remain there for long. Almost without conscious intention they traveled briefly toward the study door, then to the curtains, then the fire, then back again. The movement occupied scarcely a heartbeat, yet repeated itself with quiet regularity. A man who expects interruption eventually acquires the habit of searching for it. "My dear fellow," his voice remained remarkably steady, "you have come. I thought it wiser." So did I. We shook hands. His grip retained much of its former firmness, though I fancied it ended just a fraction sooner than it once would have done. "It has been too long." It has. No further embellishment seemed required. Friendship of many years often expresses itself most sincerely through economy. Sir Edmund gestured toward the hearth. "You must be chilled after such a journey. I have encountered less hospitable weather." A faint smile appeared. "It appears England has not." The expression lingered only briefly before yielding once more to thoughtful weariness. Without another word, he crossed to the silver tray. The crystal decanter caught the lamplight beautifully as he lifted it. Within, the amber brandy moved with slow elegance, casting warm reflections upon the polished surface of the tray. He selected one of the waiting glasses and poured with practiced precision. The liquid struck crystal with a soft musical note. Then another. He filled the second glass. Only as he replaced the decanter did I observe the slight tremor returning to his fingers. It was scarcely sufficient to disturb the pouring, yet enough to persuade the crystal stopper to produce the gentlest of clicks against the neck of the decanter before finding its proper seat. He handed me a glass. The crystal felt pleasantly cool. Within it the brandy glowed like captured firelight. I raised it slightly. "To your health, and to your timely arrival." The glasses met with the quietest suggestion of a chime. For several moments neither of us spoke. The fire settled lower. Rain whispered patiently beyond the curtains. Leather sighed softly as Sir Edmund resumed his place in the great wingback chair beside the hearth. I accepted the chair opposite, whose deep cushions welcomed me with familiar generosity. The first sip of brandy carried warmth rather than sharpness. It spread gradually through the chill gathered during the drive, encouraging the hands to relax around the glass while filling the room with its mellow fragrance of oak spice and distant vineyards. Sir Edmund turned the glass thoughtfully between his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice scarcely rose above the crackling of the fire. "I cannot adequately express how relieved I am that you chose not to wait until morning. I confess your letter discouraged patience." It did rather more than discourage mine. He glanced instinctively toward the closed study door. The movement was slight, almost involuntary. "Gibbons believes the house asleep. I trust it is." "So do I." A long silence followed. It was not uncomfortable, merely careful. The sort of silence during which a gentleman arranges facts before deciding how best to present them. At length he looked steadily into the fire. "The disturbances I described in my letter," he paused, "have not ceased. The flames shifted quietly among the logs. They have become bolder." I waited. When the messenger departed with my letter, I believed I had perhaps exaggerated the seriousness of matters. His fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the crystal. I no longer possess that comfort. Again the rain murmured beyond the thick curtains. Again the grandfather clock somewhere distant within the house marked another measured second. Sir Edmund spoke even more softly. This evening, after dinner, every member of the household retired exactly as expected. The guests, all accounted for. The servants, they withdrew shortly afterward. He nodded slowly. I remained here. His eyes traveled once more toward the study door. I intended to await your arrival tomorrow. The words hung quietly between us. Instead, he drew a measured breath. Not half an hour ago. He stopped. The silence that followed seemed almost to acquire substance. Then, in little more than a whisper, he continued. I distinctly heard someone turn this very door handle. His gaze never left it. The handle moved. Another quiet pause. But when I opened the door, he looked at me with an expression I had never before seen upon his face. The corridor was entirely empty. He lowered his voice still further. And scarcely a minute later, Gibbons came to tell me that someone was knocking at the front door. For several moments after Sir Edmund's final words, neither of us spoke. The fire continued its quiet labor within the grate, while the rain maintained its patient conversation with the hidden windows beyond the velvet curtains. Between those two familiar sounds lay a silence that seemed somehow altered. It no longer belonged to comfort alone. It possessed expectation. I set my crystal glass carefully upon the little table beside my chair. Its base met the polished mahogany with scarcely more than a whisper. If you will permit me, I said at length, I should like to look at the corridor before the household begins to stir. Sir Edmund inclined his head almost immediately. I had hoped you would. His voice remained low, instinctively mindful of those sleeping elsewhere beneath the great roof. Gibbons has gone to prepare your room. We shall not be disturbed. I rose. The warmth of the study accompanied me only as far as the door. When I opened it, the corridor beyond received me with an altogether different character. The chill announced itself first. It was not an unpleasant cold, nor the sharp, penetrating dampness of the rain outside, but rather the measured coolness peculiar to old country houses, whose long passageways seem forever engaged in quiet conversation with the stone from which they were built. Somewhere unseen, a patient draught wandered through the ancient timbers, touching the back of one's hands before disappearing again into darkness. I drew the door almost closed behind me, leaving only the narrowest suggestion of light escaping from Sir Edmund's study. Immediately the corridor appeared vastly longer. The oak paneling stretched away in either direction until it dissolved into shadow, interrupted only by a single wall sconce burning with a modest flame some distance ahead. Its gentle light reached only a little way before surrendering to darkness once more, leaving carved moldings and framed portraits to emerge briefly before fading again into obscurity. High above, stained glass windows admitted no moonlight. Only the rain. Its steady tapping upon the leaded panes descended from the darkness overhead with a remarkable softness, as though the weather itself had become reluctant to disturb the sleeping house. Far behind me, almost imperceptible now, the grandfather clock in the entrance hall continued its patient occupation. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Each measured beat traveled faintly through the timbered corridors like the quiet pulse of the manor itself. From my waistcoat pocket I withdrew a small silver torch. Its polished casing had accompanied me upon many investigations, occupying scarcely more room than a gentleman's spectacles, while proving rather more dependable than candles, when one required both light and freedom of movement. A gentle pressure of the switch awakened its modest beam. Not brilliant, merely sufficient. The narrow circle of light settled upon the polished floorboards before my feet, revealing warm ribbons of oak, whose careful waxing reflected the beam in softened amber. I advanced slowly. There is little advantage in hurrying when one seeks what another has overlooked. Sir Edmund had indicated the precise place where the handle had moved. I paused before the study door. At first glance the floor appeared immaculate. The boards possessed the rich luster earned only through generations of polishing, while every joint between them remained clean and sharply defined. Nothing suggested intrusion. Yet first glances have misled better detectives than I. I allowed the beam to travel gradually across the floor, not searching for objects so much as interruptions. A scuff. A fiber. A change in the reflection. The light lingered near the threshold, then stopped. There, scarcely wider than my little finger, lay an irregular smear interrupting the otherwise flawless polish. I lowered myself carefully. Old floorboards answer kneeling gentlemen with occasional remarks of their own, and I preferred not to encourage unnecessary conversation from the house. The mark became clearer. Mud. Only the smallest quantity. Fresh enough that its edges had not yet entirely dried, though sufficiently disturbed to suggest movement rather than a stationary foot. I removed the magnifying glass from my pocket. Its silver rim caught the faint beam before enlarging the little stain into surprising clarity. Embedded within the mud rested tiny grains of pale gravel. The impression itself proved incomplete, yet one detail remained unmistakable. The outer edge bore the faint parallel ridges characteristic of a heavy leather riding boot whose sole had acquired wear through long use. Not a gentleman's evening shoe. Certainly not a servant's softer indoor footwear. A riding boot. Interesting. I studied it for another quiet moment before withdrawing my notebook. The leather cover opened with familiar ease. My pencil moved slowly across the page. A small quantity of fresh mud upon the study threshold. Pale gravel. Riding boot. Recent. The scratching of graphite against paper sounded curiously loud in the sleeping corridor. I returned both notebook and magnifying glass to my pocket. Only as I rose did something else present itself. Not to the eye. To memory. Or perhaps to instinct. I remained perfectly still. The air in old houses acquires remarkable habits. Rooms preserve certain fragrances for years. Beeswax, books, fireplaces, polished wood. One ceases consciously to notice them because they belong. This did not belong. Very faintly, scarcely stronger than a remembered perfume, another scent lingered beneath the familiar atmosphere. Sweet. Warm. Exotic. I drew a slow breath. It came again. Turkish tobacco. Not the wholesome, earthy fragrance that had settled comfortably into Sir Edmund's study over decades of faithful pipe smoking, but something altogether richer. Softer. Almost floral beneath its spice. The sort of tobacco one occasionally encountered in London, clubs frequented by gentlemen who preferred imported cigarettes wrapped in dark paper rather than English pipes. It lingered only lightly. Enough to suggest that its owner had stood here. Not long ago. I made another quiet note. Then extinguished the torch for a moment. Darkness gathered immediately around me. Only the distant sconce remained. Only the rain. Only the grandfather clock. Sometimes, silence reveals more than light. Finding nothing further, I awakened the torch once more and continued along the corridor. The beam wandered patiently before me. Portraits emerged one after another from the darkness. Long-forgotten Blackwoods gazed solemnly across the generations, their painted eyes seeming almost to follow the slow movement of my light before retreating once more into shadow. The passage gradually widened. Ahead lay the great staircase. Its broad oak banister descended gracefully toward the entrance hall below, where a single lamp burned throughout the night with quiet fidelity. The grandfather clock stood there still, faithfully measuring the sleeping hours. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. As I approached the first step, something interrupted the beam. A pale shape. Small enough that another pace would almost certainly have carried me beyond it. I stopped. Then knelt once more. Upon the polished floor rested a handkerchief. It had been fashioned from exceptionally fine white linen, its border finished with delicate lacework so intricate that each tiny loop appeared to have been formed by astonishingly patient hands. Even beneath the modest light, I could see that it belonged to someone who appreciated refinement beyond mere practicality. I lifted it gently. The linen felt cool. not merely from the night air. Damp. Not rain. The moisture possessed none of the scattered pattern left by falling drops. Instead, it seemed evenly absorbed, as though the fabric had remained clasped for some time within a warm, perspiring hand before being dropped unnoticed upon the floor. Very faintly, another fragrance reached me. Lavender. Fresh enough to survive the surrounding odors of old timber and extinguished fires. I unfolded one corner. No embroidered initials presented themselves. Curious. Another note joined the first within my notebook before I folded the handkerchief carefully and placed it inside an empty pocket of my overcoat. 2 observations. Neither explained the other, yet neither seemed inclined toward coincidence. I remained kneeling for a little while longer, allowing my gaze to travel slowly upward. The staircase disappeared into darkness. Beyond its upper landing lay the bedrooms. Sir Edmund's guests. The sleeping household. Somewhere above rested the owner of the riding boots. Or perhaps the owner of the handkerchief. Possibly both. Possibly neither. The rain continued its endless recital beyond the stained glass windows. The clock marked another patient second. Then, from somewhere upon the unseen floor above, there came the unmistakable sound of a single floorboard creaking beneath a measured weight. Not loudly. Not hurriedly. Simply once. And then the house became perfectly still again. For several quiet moments after the sound had faded, I remained exactly where I was. My hand still rested upon the folded handkerchief concealed within the deep pocket of my overcoat. The faint fragrance of lavender lingered upon my glove, though whether it arose from the linen itself or merely from memory, I could not have said with certainty. The house had resumed its composure. The rain continued steadily beyond the walls. Far below, softened by distance and oak paneling, the grandfather clock pursued its solemn occupation. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. I looked toward the staircase. The upper landing remained entirely hidden. Darkness possesses curious qualities in old houses. At first it appears impenetrable. Given sufficient patience, however, it begins to surrender, not by becoming brighter, but by quietly revealing distinctions where previously there had seemed only blackness. For that reason, I did not immediately awaken my little silver torch. Instead, I slipped it once more into my waistcoat pocket and allowed my eyes the opportunity to become acquainted with the shadows. Gradually the staircase disclosed itself. The broad banister emerged first, its polished oak reflecting the faintest suggestion of light rising from the entrance hall below. Beyond it appeared the outlines of carved balusters, each turned by a craftsman whose work had outlived him by many generations. I laid my gloved hand upon the smooth timber. Its surface retained the coolness of the sleeping house, worn to remarkable softness by countless hands that had traveled the same ascent through countless years. Very gently I placed one foot upon the first step. Old staircases possess personalities. Some complain. Others remain discreet. The tread accepted my weight with admirable restraint. Only when I had satisfied myself that no protest would follow did I allow my full weight to settle. Then another step. And another. Each was approached in precisely the same manner. Heel. Pause. Wait. Listen. The rhythm became almost meditative. Above me, unseen corridors breathed quietly. A cool current of air descended from the upper floor, carrying with it the unmistakable fragrance of old beeswax, linen cupboards, extinguished fireplaces, and timber that had known many winters. Every now and then the draught shifted almost imperceptibly, suggesting distant passageways whose doors were not quite as closely fitted as they had once been. Beyond the roof the rain altered its music. Down below it had sounded gentle, softened by thick walls and sheltered windows. Here, nearer the slates, individual showers could be distinguished as they swept across the great expanse of the manor roof. One moment, the drops whispered almost delicately, the next they gathered into fuller rhythms before subsiding once more into patient conversation. I continued upward. The velvet hem of my overcoat brushed occasionally against the oak paneling beside the staircase with the faintest suggestion of sound. Behind me the grandfather clock grew quieter still. Ahead the darkness slowly welcomed me. At length I reached the upper landing. The corridor stretched before me with impressive length, disappearing almost entirely into shadow before bending gently out of sight. Doors occupied both sides of the passage. Heavy oak doors, identical in height, each fitted with polished brass handles that reflected only the slightest hints of distant light. Between them stood occasional tables supporting porcelain vases and slender lamps whose wicks had long since been extinguished for the night. A richly woven carpet extended the entire length of the corridor. Its deep colors could scarcely be distinguished beneath the darkness, yet its thick pile received my footsteps with grateful silence. No sound emerged from behind any door. No conversation. No movement. Only the immense stillness peculiar to a house filled with sleeping strangers. I withdrew the silver torch once more. Its modest beam awakened obediently. This time I directed it downward. The circle of light wandered patiently across the carpet, revealing tiny details that darkness had concealed. The careful weave of the fabric, the occasional loose fiber, minute droplets of moisture that had evidently fallen from someone's umbrella many hours earlier before drying almost entirely. Nothing appeared disturbed. The beam moved slowly from one threshold to the next. Here stood a pair of riding boots placed neatly outside a bedroom door, their polished leather gleaming softly beneath the light. A little farther on rested a walking stick against the wall, its silver handle catching a brief glimmer before fading again into darkness. Another door possessed a folded newspaper tucked neatly beneath it, evidently delivered earlier and forgotten. Each room suggested an unseen occupant. Each closed door represented another unknown character gathered beneath Sir Edmund's roof. I advanced only a few careful paces at a time. The farther I traveled along the passage, the more complete the silence became. Even the rain seemed more distant here. My attention returned, almost without invitation, to the faint fragrance I had noticed outside Sir Edmund's study. I paused, drew one slow breath. Nothing. Then another. There it was again. So delicate that another man might easily have mistaken it for polished cedar or warm candle wax. Turkish tobacco. Not fresh enough to suggest recent smoking, yet unmistakably present. I remained perfectly still. The current of cool air drifting along the corridor carried the scent almost imperceptibly. It wandered, paused, returned, following no visible pattern except one. It seemed ever so slightly stronger toward the far end of the eastern wing. I extinguished the torch. Darkness gathered once more. Standing motionless, one becomes surprisingly sensitive to direction. Again, I breathed. Again the fragrance arrived. This time I felt almost certain. One particular door near the end of the passage appeared to lie directly within its path. Whether the room belonged to a gentleman who favored imported cigarettes, or whether someone had merely paused there earlier in the evening, remained entirely impossible to determine. I had just begun to consider a closer inspection when another light appeared. Not ahead. Below. A warm amber glow rose gradually from the staircase, advancing one careful step at a time. It moved with none of the uncertainty belonging to intruders. Its progress was measured, familiar, almost domestic. I slipped the torch silently back into my pocket. The upper landing surrendered once more to darkness. Presently, the glow resolved itself into a single candle carried within a polished silver candlestick. Behind it came Gibbons. The elderly butler ascended with remarkable steadiness despite the late hour. Draped neatly across one forearm rested a freshly ironed linen towel whose whiteness appeared almost luminous in the candlelight. Upon seeing me, he stopped immediately. "I'm relieved to find you, sir," he said in little more than a whisper. "I feared you might have mistaken the turning. I was acquainting myself with the house." "Very sensible, sir." The candle flame bent gently as a cool draught descended the staircase. "I have prepared your room." He spoke with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose duties, faithfully performed, brought comfort both to others and to himself. For a moment we stood together listening to the rain. I found myself asking, as casually as one gentleman might inquire after the weather, "Tell me, Gibbons, Are any of Sir Edmund's guests accustomed to remaining awake particularly late? He reflected before answering. Not habitually, sir. Another thoughtful pause. Though Colonel Ashcombe has occasionally been known to enjoy a cigarette before retiring. Nothing more. Nothing less. The reply was delivered without speculation, merely as an observation honestly remembered. I inclined my head. Thank you. If you would be so good as to follow me. He turned. The candle carried its gentle circle of warmth along the dark corridor, touching polished brass, carved oak, and framed landscapes before leaving each once more to shadow. I followed in silence. The faint scent of Turkish tobacco had already begun to dissolve into the ancient fragrances of the sleeping house. At length Gibbons stopped before a modest oak door. He opened it quietly. This room has been prepared for your comfort, sir. I entered. The chamber proved smaller than Sir Edmund's study, though no less welcoming. A modest fire remained upon the hearth, its glowing embers occasionally producing the softest crackle as another fragment of wood settled gently into ash. The warmth lingered pleasantly within the room, while beyond the curtained windows the rain continued its endless recital against the ancient stone of Blackwood Manor. The door closed with remarkable gentleness. Its latch settled into place with little more than a quiet note of polished brass meeting seasoned oak, and then even that modest sound dissolved into the greater silence of the room. I remained where I was. There seemed no immediate necessity for movement. Beyond the curtained windows the rain continued its endless occupation. It did not hurry, it did not falter. The drops travelled steadily across the slate roof above before descending the ancient stone walls in countless unseen rivulets. Occasionally a faint breath of wind persuaded the weather to alter its rhythm, only for the familiar cadence to return a moment later, patient as ever. Behind me the fire had entered its final thoughtful hours. The lively flames of earlier had surrendered to a bed of crimson embers, each one glowing softly beneath a delicate veil of pale ash. Every now and then some hidden pocket of warmth found fresh air enough to brighten for an instant before subsiding once more into a comfortable glow. The room appeared entirely content. Its modest furnishings neither demanded admiration nor invited notice through extravagance. They simply existed with quiet confidence, as though they had welcomed many weary travelers before me, and expected, in due course, to welcome many more. Only after allowing myself another slow breath did I begin the little ceremonies by which one exchanges the road for temporary shelter. My hands rose to the collar of my overcoat. The uppermost button yielded first. Then another. And another. Each passed through its buttonhole, with the faintest whisper of wool against wool. The coat, relieved of its duty, settled gradually across my shoulders before I eased it free altogether. Its weight surprised me. Not because it was burdensome, but because one seldom notices the faithful labor of a well-made garment until it is no longer there. The charcoal wool retained a little of the night's dampness upon its outer surface. Here and there tiny droplets still clung stubbornly to the fabric, catching the glow of the fire before disappearing into the weave. A plain wooden valet stand occupied one corner of the room beside the wardrobe. I laid the coat carefully across its broad shoulders. There was no virtue in haste. The folds arranged themselves naturally, while the damp wool released the faint fragrance of clean rain mingled with cedar and the open countryside. Satisfied that it would dry comfortably before morning, I turned my attention to my gloves. Black leather grows wonderfully supple with years of honest use. I drew the first glove free finger by finger. The leather offered a slight resistance before yielding altogether. The second followed in precisely the same manner. Freed from them, my hands welcomed the quiet warmth lingering within the room. I placed the gloves neatly upon the chair beneath the overcoat. Habit has a way of arranging small objects with surprising precision. Only then did I reach into the deep pocket of my coat. My fingers encountered folded linen. I withdrew it carefully. The handkerchief unfolded beneath the low firelight with remarkable delicacy. The lace bordering its edges appeared almost translucent where the glow touched it, each tiny stitch revealing the patient workmanship of someone who understood that refinement often resides in details too small to attract immediate attention. I held one corner lightly between my fingers. The linen had dried somewhat since I had found it upon the corridor floor, yet it retained the faintest coolness. I examined it once again. No initials, no laundry mark, no tiny embroidered crest concealed within the lace. Nothing that claimed ownership, only careful craftsmanship. Very slowly I lifted it nearer. The lavender remained. Gentle. Restrained. Beneath it, however, or perhaps only within memory, another fragrance returned. Not from the linen. From the corridor. From the shadows outside Sir Edmund's study. Turkish tobacco. Sweet. Exotic. Unexpected beneath an English country roof. I folded the handkerchief once more. One crease. Then another, until it resumed the modest rectangle in which it had first rested within my pocket. There would be ample opportunity to consider it tomorrow. Tonight it had already revealed everything it intended. Upon the writing desk stood a green-shaded lamp, turned low by Gibbons before my arrival. Its modest circle of light fell across polished mahogany, whose surface reflected the glow in softened ribbons. There I laid my pocket watch. The silver case gleamed briefly before coming to rest beside the leather-bound notebook. I pressed the little catch. The lid sprang open. The hands had continued their faithful progress. Not hurriedly. Never hurriedly. Steadily. The second hand completed another quiet circuit. Tick, tick, tick. The tiny mechanism possessed a voice scarcely louder than breathing. Yet within the stillness of the room it became wonderfully distinct. The watch measured minutes. The fire measured warmth. The rain measured the night. Together they formed a companionship of sounds that required no conversation. I remained listening until the minute hand advanced a little farther. 1 o'clock approached with all the quiet certainty that midnight had surrendered only an hour before. Closing the watch, I allowed my fingertips to rest for a moment upon its cool silver surface. Then I crossed the room. The curtains hung in generous folds of dark velvet, heavy enough to discourage both draughts and unnecessary curiosity. Their fabric absorbed the firelight almost completely, standing like silent sentinels before the great window. I reached for the edge. The material felt thick beneath my fingers. Slowly, very slowly, I drew it aside. Only an inch. No more. Immediately the night looked back. The grounds beyond had disappeared beneath rain and darkness, until earth, lawn and sky merged into a single expanse of charcoal gray. The occasional silver thread of falling water became visible only when it crossed the faint reflection of my own firelit window. Somewhere far below, water gathered within unseen puddles. A branch moved. Whether persuaded by wind or burdened by rain, I could not tell. Beyond that lay only blackness. Patient. Watchful. Entirely unreadable. I remained there for several moments, content merely to observe that which refused to be observed in return. Then, with equal care, I allowed the curtain to fall back into place. The room gathered around me once more. The fire. The quiet ticking of the watch. The gentle breathing of old timber. And the steady rain, softened now by velvet and stone, until it became little more than a distant lullaby accompanying the long hours before dawn. For a little while longer I remained standing before the curtains, my hand resting lightly upon the heavy velvet where I had only moments before drawn it closed. The room had become a small world unto itself. Beyond those folds of fabric the rain continued its endless occupation of the night, but here within, its voice arrived softened by thick stone, old timber and generous cloth, until it resembled the quiet breathing of a distant sea. The embers upon the hearth glowed patiently. They no longer sought attention. Instead they offered companionship. Every now and then some hidden pocket of warmth awakened briefly beneath its covering of pale ash, releasing a modest crimson pulse before settling once more into contented stillness. I found my thoughts returning, almost without invitation, to the writing desk. It occupied a comfortable corner beside the fire, fashioned from dark mahogany, whose polished surface reflected the green-shaded lamp in muted ribbons of amber. There was something reassuring in its orderly proportions. A desk asks very little of a man beyond honesty and patience. Both seemed desirable companions. I crossed the room slowly. The carpet accepted each step without remark. Behind me, the fire answered with the gentlest sigh. The chair awaiting the desk was upholstered in dark cloth, its broad wings curving inward with quiet hospitality. I rested one hand upon its carved arm before lowering myself into it, allowing the familiar little sounds of settling wood and fabric to accompany the movement. The chair welcomed me as though it had been expecting precisely such an occupation. Upon the polished writing surface lay my leather-bound notebook. Beside it rested my fountain pen. Its black barrel possessed the mellow sheen that long use alone can bestow. Time had softened every sharp edge beneath years of careful handling until it seemed less an instrument than an old acquaintance. I lifted it. Very gently I unscrewed the cap. One turn. Pause. Another. Pause. A final quiet turn. The threads released one another with almost imperceptible precision. I placed the cap carefully beside the notebook. Then, I opened the cover. The leather yielded with a familiar suppleness. Several earlier pages contained observations from investigations long concluded, each written in a hand that had grown steadier rather than quicker with advancing years. Beyond them waited clean paper. Blank. Patient. Entirely without opinion. I turned to the first empty page. Its surface possessed the faint texture peculiar to well-made stationery, smooth enough to welcome ink while retaining just enough character to reward the movement of a careful pen. I laid the palm of my hand lightly across it. Not to flatten it, for there was nothing to flatten, but merely to acquaint myself once more with the reassuring crispness of untouched paper. Beside the notebook stood the little bottle of black ink I had packed within my valise. Removing its stopper required no haste. A gentle twist. A slight resistance. Then freedom. The faint fragrance of ink rose into the warm air. Clean. Mineral. Comfortingly familiar. I dipped the nib. Not deeply. Only sufficiently for the reservoir to accept its modest burden. The excess returned to the bottle with the smallest suggestion of a drop. I replaced the stopper. The ritual completed itself with quiet satisfaction. For a few moments I simply held the pen above the page. One should never begin by writing. One begins by thinking. The first line appeared slowly. Blackwood Manor. Below it, after another thoughtful pause, residents and guests. The nib whispered softly across the paper. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. The sound proved remarkably soothing. Sir Edmund Blackwood. Gibbons. Colonel Ashcombe. Mr. Fairchild. The remaining guests would be added when I had properly made their acquaintance. Guesswork has never deserved the dignity of ink. The pen rested for a moment while I considered the single name already demanding rather more attention than the others. Colonel Ashcombe. The butler had remarked, with admirable restraint, that the colonel occasionally enjoyed a cigarette before retiring. Nothing extraordinary. Many gentlemen did. Yet the observation had attached itself almost immediately to another. Turkish tobacco. Again the fragrance returned to memory with surprising clarity. It had lingered outside Sir Edmund's study. It had drifted along the upper corridor. And unless my senses had entirely deceived me, it had seemed strongest toward one particular room at the eastern end of the passage. I allowed the pen to descend once more. Turkish tobacco. A brief pause. Detected in study corridor. Another. Stronger in eastern wing. The words occupied only a little space upon the page. They carried rather more weight within the mind. My thoughts wandered naturally to the folded handkerchief now resting inside the pocket of my overcoat across the room. Fine linen. Lace border. Lavender. No initials. Dropped, or perhaps lost, upon the floor beneath the staircase. Its owner remained unknown. yet it had been found upon the path between Sir Edmund's study and the sleeping quarters above. Coincidence occasionally performs useful work. More often it merely introduces acquaintances who have not yet admitted they know one another. I wrote one final note. Handkerchief may connect movements through corridor. Not certainty. Only possibility. Possibilities deserve preservation. Conclusions may wait. The nib lingered above the page before I cleaned it carefully with a folded square of blotting paper. Press. Lift. Press. Lift. The ink surrendered without complaint. I rested the pen across the notebook. Silence reclaimed the room. Only the rain continued its patient recital beyond the curtains. Then, from somewhere deep within the sleeping manor, there arose the measured voice of the grandfather clock. One solemn chime. Then, another. Each traveled upward through ancient beams and quiet passageways, softened by distance until the sound resembled a memory more than a bell. A third. A fourth. The house seemed to listen with me. The chimes continued, never hurried, each separated by a generous interval of silence. At length, the final note faded gently into the warm darkness. 1 o'clock. The clock resumed its quieter occupation. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. I closed the notebook with deliberate care. The leather cover settled softly against its pages. Outside, the rain accepted the hour without comment, continuing its endless, comforting rhythm against the ancient stones of Blackwood Manor, while the little desk lamp and the fading embers together kept faithful watch over the long remainder of the night. For some little while after closing my notebook, I remained seated at the writing desk without any intention of adding another word. The page had accepted what it required. The pen had completed its duty. Beyond that, the night itself seemed to ask for silence. The green-shaded lamp continued to cast its modest circle of amber across the polished mahogany. Outside that gentle pool of light, the room had already surrendered itself to shadow. The corners lay undisturbed. The wardrobe stood quietly against the wall. My overcoat rested where I had left it, its dampness now yielding gradually to the warmth that lingered within the chamber. The fire upon the hearth had grown still gentler. No flames remained. Only embers. Deep crimson beneath pale ash. From time to time one glowed a little brighter, as though taking a slow, contented breath before settling once more into restful quiet. I reached for the lamp. The little switch yielded beneath my fingertips. The amber glow disappeared. Darkness entered the room not as an intruder but as an old acquaintance. For a moment I stood without moving. The eyes require very little encouragement to begin their work. Gradually the familiar outlines returned. The hearth first. Then the pale rectangle of the curtained window. Then the broad silhouette of the bed waiting peacefully across the room. I crossed toward it at an unhurried pace. The carpet accepted each footstep with grateful discretion. Only the faint rustle of my clothing accompanied the movement. The bed itself possessed the reassuring solidity that belongs to old furniture fashioned without economy. 4 stout posts rose into shadow above the canopy, while the heavy linen curtains had already been drawn back by careful hands in anticipation of my arrival. I rested one hand upon the polished bedpost. The timber retained a little of the day's warmth. With the other I folded back the uppermost blanket. The linen beneath answered with the faintest whisper. There are few sounds more quietly satisfying than freshly pressed sheets disturbed for the first time. The fabric felt wonderfully cool, smooth, crisp, patient. I sat upon the edge of the mattress. It yielded only slightly beneath my weight before finding its balance once again. Removing my shoes became another small ceremony. One lace, then the other. The leather released my feet with quiet willingness after the long journey through the rain. I placed the shoes neatly together beside the bed. Habit has a way of preserving order even when no one else is present to observe it. At length, I settled beneath the covers. The linen welcomed me first. Then the blanket. Finally the heavier quilt. I drew it upward until it rested comfortably across my chest. Its weight proved immediately reassuring. Not burdensome. Protective. The room gathered around me. The embers continued their patient rhythm upon the hearth. Soft crackle. Pause. A tiny settling of ash. Silence. Then another quiet pulse of crimson. Beyond the thick curtains, the rain pursued its endless occupation. Not loudly. Never loudly. It traveled across the great roof, down the ancient stone, into unseen gutters, across sleeping lawns. Every surface contributed its own modest note until the weather became less a collection of sounds than a single continuous lullaby. I allowed my breathing to find the same rhythm. A slow breath. Another. The quilt settled a fraction lower. Another breath. The mattress accepted my weight a little more completely. Thoughts of the investigation lingered only briefly. A muddy smear beside the study. The faint sweetness of Turkish tobacco. The lace-trimmed handkerchief. Each observation floated quietly through the mind before drifting away again like leaves carried downstream. There would be time enough for deduction when daylight arrived. Night asks different things of a man. It asks only that he listen. The embers breathed. The rain answered. The old house replied with tiny conversations of timber and stone that belonged neither to danger nor to comfort alone, but simply to age. Somewhere very far away, the grandfather clock continued its faithful occupation. Its ticking reached my room only faintly now. Almost imagined. Almost part of sleep itself. Gradually, the distinction between wakefulness and dreaming became pleasantly uncertain. The darkness seemed warmer. The rain more distant. The quilt a little heavier. A quiet contentment settled over the room until it became difficult to remember that beyond these walls lay unanswered questions and unfamiliar guests. Time passed. How much, I cannot say. The embers had diminished further when awareness returned. Not suddenly. Not completely. Rather as a small boat rises almost imperceptibly upon a gentle tide. My eyes remained closed. My breathing scarcely altered. Yet somewhere beneath the comfort of sleep, another faculty had quietly awakened. There had been something. Not a loud sound. Indeed, I could not honestly have described it as a sound at all. More a subtle alteration within the immense silence of the manor. I remained perfectly still. The rain continued exactly as before. The embers settled softly. No wind disturbed the curtains. Then it came again. Very faintly. So faintly that another listener might have mistaken it for imagination. A delicate metallic movement. Not prolonged. Merely the careful turning of brass against brass. A door handle. Somewhere along the eastern wing. The mechanism moved with remarkable caution. Not forced. Not hurried. Simply turned. I listened. Silence followed. Long enough that I began to wonder whether I had dreamed the entire thing. Then, the gentlest creak. Old hinges speaking only a single word. Followed almost immediately by the soft, muffled note of a door returning quietly to its frame. Nothing more. No footsteps. No voices. No hurried retreat. Only the rain. Only the dying fire. Only the immense breathing silence of Blackwood Manor. My eyes opened into the darkness. I neither moved nor reached for the matches upon the bedside table. Even my breathing grew shallower. Patiently I listened through the heavy oak door, allowing the stillness of the sleeping house to reveal, if it chose, whatever might come next. I did not move. For several quiet moments after my eyes had opened, I allowed the darkness to remain exactly as it was, resisting the temptation to seek immediate explanation for what I had heard. The room had altered very little. Only the fire. Its embers had withdrawn still farther into themselves, glowing now beneath a deeper covering of pale ash. From time to time, one tiny point of crimson brightened gently before fading again, as though the hearth itself had settled into a slow and comfortable sleep. The rain continued its faithful occupation beyond the walls, soft upon the roof, softer still against the high windows. A steady murmur wrapped around the old manor until it became almost impossible to distinguish where the weather ended and the silence began. I listened. One slow breath. Then another. Nothing. No footsteps crossed the corridor. No whisper drifted beneath the door. No hinge complained. Whatever movement had disturbed the sleeping house had already completed its purpose. Only then did I allow myself to stir. Very carefully I folded back the quilt. The heavy fabric yielded with scarcely more than the faintest sigh, before settling into gentle folds upon the mattress. Cool air greeted my hands and face immediately, reminding me how warmly the bed had enclosed me only moments before. I swung my legs over the side. My feet found the rug first, then the familiar softness of my leather slippers, waiting precisely where I had placed them. The leather accepted my feet with quiet familiarity. No buckle, no lace, only the reassuring comfort of long acquaintance. Across the chair beside the bed rested a wool dressing gown prepared by Gibbons before retiring. Its folds lay neatly arranged, the belt draped patiently across one sleeve. I lifted it. The cloth felt warm where it had lingered near the hearth. Drawing one arm through, then the other. I gathered the gown about my chest and secured the belt with deliberate fingers, tightening it only enough to discourage the night's coolness. There remained no need for haste. If someone had indeed passed along the eastern corridor, several minutes had already elapsed. A gentleman gains little by hurrying after silence. The embers breathed quietly behind me. I crossed the room. The carpet accepted each step without the least suggestion of sound. Even the old floor beneath appeared content to preserve its composure. At length I reached the oak door. For a moment my hand hovered above the brass handle. The metal, when my fingers finally touched it, had surrendered entirely to the coolness of the sleeping house. I closed my hand around it, waited, then began to turn it. Not quickly, very slowly. So slowly that the mechanism seemed almost reluctant to admit movement at all. A tiny resistance. Then, click. The sound scarcely exceeded the settling of ash upon the hearth. I paused once more. Nothing answered. Satisfied, I eased the heavy door inward. Only a few inches. The narrow opening admitted a ribbon of darkness. Behind me the embers cast one final crimson glow across the floorboards, before the room surrendered almost entirely to shadow. I looked into the corridor. At first I saw almost nothing. The landing remained immersed in the great stillness of the manor. Gradually, however, familiar shapes emerged. The banister, the outline of framed portraits, the darker rectangles of closed bedroom doors stretching away into the eastern wing. No lamp burned. No candle remained. Only the patient night. I widened the opening just enough to pass through. The door settled almost closed behind me without quite meeting its frame. The thick woven carpet welcomed my slippers immediately. Its deep pile received every step with remarkable generosity, preserving the silence as faithfully as snow preserves footprints. I stood motionless upon the landing, listening. The grandfather clock continued somewhere far below. Its measured pulse reached me only faintly now. Tick. ... Tock. ... Tick. The intervals between each beat seemed unusually generous, allowing the silence ample room in which to unfold. A cool current wandered gently through the corridor. It carried the familiar fragrances I had already come to associate with Blackwood Manor. Beeswax, old oak, books, the dry sweetness of linen cupboards, ash from fires long reduced to embers. Then another fragrance appeared, almost imperceptibly. Sweet, warm, exotic. I drew another careful breath. There could be no uncertainty this time. Turkish tobacco. Fresh. Far fresher than before. It had not merely lingered. It had recently passed this way. I remained perfectly still, allowing the current to reveal its direction. The scent wandered gently through the sleeping corridor before gathering itself once more, toward the eastern wing, toward the same distant section of the passage that had attracted my attention earlier in the night. The coincidence had grown steadily less willing to describe itself as coincidence. Without reaching for my torch, I allowed my eyes another few moments to study the darkness. A faint grey outline marked the distant window at the end of the passage. The rest remained almost entirely black. That suited me perfectly well. Bright light often announces curiosity before curiosity has accomplished anything useful. I advanced. One quiet step. Then another. The soft leather of my slippers glided almost noiselessly across the carpet. The hem of the dressing gown brushed lightly against my ankles with each measured movement. No door stirred. No floorboard objected. Only the rain continued above, whispering across the roof in slow, unbroken rhythms that seemed to accompany my progress through the darkness. The scent strengthened. Not dramatically, only enough that I no longer needed to search for it. It seemed to rest quietly in the air ahead, waiting with remarkable patience beside one particular section of the eastern corridor. I continued toward it with the same deliberate care, while behind every closed door the sleeping house preserved its silence, and the ancient manor seemed to watch without revealing whether it intended to keep or surrender its secrets before dawn. The farther I proceeded along the eastern wing, the more deliberate my pace became. There comes a point in every careful approach when movement ceases to be measured by distance and begins instead to be measured by attention. Each step deserved consideration. Each breath. Each pause. The corridor had narrowed only slightly, yet the darkness seemed somehow more complete here, as though this end of the manor had withdrawn a little farther from the waking world. Behind the walls, the rain maintained its patient recital. Upon the roof, against the distant panes, through hidden gutters, its voice neither rose nor fell. It simply continued, steady enough that one might almost forget it until a brief silence within the house reminded the ear that the weather had never departed at all. I advanced another pace. The fragrance reached me before the door itself emerged fully from the shadows. Turkish tobacco. Sweet, dry, rich, without heaviness. There could no longer be the slightest uncertainty regarding its source. The air seemed to hold it with remarkable fidelity. Not stale, not lingering from some earlier hour. Fresh enough that its warmth had not yet entirely surrendered itself to the sleeping house. I allowed myself one slow breath. Then another. No investigator profits by hurrying his senses. At length, I arrived before the door. It stood precisely as the others along the corridor had stood. Heavy oak. Deeply polished. Its brass handle reflected nothing at all within the darkness. Only one detail distinguished it from every other guest chamber upon the landing. Near the threshold, where the bottom of the door met the woven carpet, there appeared the narrowest imaginable thread of light, so fine that I might easily have overlooked it had I approached more hastily. A slender ribbon of warm gold. It escaped beneath the door in perfect silence before dissolving upon the dark carpet scarcely an inch beyond the threshold. Someone remained awake. I neither leaned closer nor stepped away. Instead, I allowed the observation to settle quietly among the others already gathered throughout the evening. The muddy smear outside Sir Edmund's study. The unfamiliar tobacco drifting through the corridor. The lace-trimmed handkerchief discovered near the staircase. And now, a guest awake beyond 2 o'clock in the morning. None of these facts, considered independently, compelled any immediate conclusion. Together, however, they had begun to acquire a certain gravity. My thoughts returned briefly to Colonel Ashcombe. Our acquaintance had been necessarily brief. A courteous gentleman. Reserved without becoming distant. His conversation, during those few introductory moments downstairs, had possessed the calm economy of one accustomed to saying no more than circumstances required. There had been nothing theatrical in his manner, nothing obviously suspicious. Yet it was Gibbons who had recalled, without prompting, that the Colonel occasionally enjoyed a cigarette before retiring. Such habits often reveal themselves more faithfully than character. Again I drew a careful breath. The tobacco remained unmistakable. It drifted beneath the threshold in faint, invisible currents, mingling with the older fragrances of oak, beeswax, and polished brass. The room beyond possessed its own quiet climate. I found myself studying the narrow strip of golden light with unexpected interest. It neither widened nor diminished. Somewhere within, a candle burned steadily. Not carried, not moving, merely burning. I imagined its modest flame standing beside a chair or writing table, patiently illuminating whatever quiet occupation had delayed its owner beyond the ordinary hour of sleep. The temptation to discover more presented itself only briefly. The brass handle rested scarcely a foot from my hand. One gentle movement, one careful turn. Yet curiosity and wisdom are not invariably companions. A closed door often protects more than the person behind it. It preserves opportunity. Observation, once interrupted, can never be restored to its original innocence. I had not come in search of confrontation. I had come in search of understanding. So I remained exactly where I was, perfectly still, listening. The rain continued. Softly, endlessly. Then, a sound. Not speech. Nothing so distinct. Rather the quiet rustle of paper disturbed by careful hands. It came only once. A measured movement, as though a folded document had been opened upon a desk. Several moments passed. Another gentle sound followed. Wood against wood. Very slight. A drawer, perhaps. Not closed. Only eased inward with considerable care. Then silence reclaimed the corridor once more. The light beneath the door remained unchanged. The fragrance lingered. Nothing further invited itself to the ear. I allowed another slow breath to settle my thoughts. Whatever business occupied the room, it was being conducted with remarkable discretion. Whether innocent or otherwise remained, for the present, entirely beyond proof. The sensible course appeared increasingly clear. Morning possesses a generosity toward investigations that darkness rarely shares. Servants awaken. Breakfast gathers people together. Conversations begin naturally. The smallest observations often emerge without effort when no one suspects they are being observed. Satisfied that the night had yielded all it intended for the moment, I prepared to withdraw. Very gently I shifted my weight. The carpet accepted the movement without complaint. I had scarcely completed the first silent step when the great-grandfather clock somewhere deep within the house announced the passing quarter hour. The sound reached the eastern wing, softened by distance and ancient timber. One low chime. It floated through the sleeping corridors with the unhurried dignity of an old friend. The note lingered, slowly faded, and became almost imperceptibly part of the rain itself. For another moment I remained motionless in the darkness, listening as the manor settled once more into its vast and patient silence, before turning quietly toward my room, with the certainty that the house had revealed enough for one night, and that dawn, when it came, would ask a different set of questions. For several moments after leaving the eastern wing, I neither hastened my steps nor looked behind me. The darkness had resumed possession of the corridor. Whatever quiet occupation continued beyond Colonel Ashcombe's closed door remained enclosed there, hidden behind oak panels and candlelight, as private now as when I had first discovered it. The rain continued above, softly, patiently, without interruption. It traveled across the broad slate roof, in long, even phrases before descending unseen through ancient gutters and disappearing into the unseen gardens below. The old manor seemed content merely to listen. I retraced my path. One measured step, then another. The thick carpet welcomed my slippers with such complete generosity that I could scarcely persuade myself I had moved at all. Behind every closed bedroom door, silence endured. No latch stirred. No floorboard murmured. No whispered conversation escaped into the passage. Only the immense stillness of a sleeping house. The grandfather clock somewhere in the great hall below continued faithfully with its invisible labor. Tick. ... Tock. ... Tick. The intervals appeared almost limitless. Each one seemed large enough to contain an entire thought, before quietly releasing it into silence again. By degrees, I reached my own room. The familiar brass handle waited beneath my hand, cool from the night's lingering chill. I rested my fingers upon it without immediately turning. There is a curious satisfaction in pausing before entering a warm room. One senses the comfort before reclaiming it. Very gently I turned the handle. The mechanism yielded with scarcely more than a whispered movement. The heavy oak door opened only enough to admit me. A faint glow from the hearth reached across the floorboards. Not light, merely the last quiet remembrance of it. I stepped inside. Behind me, I guided the door back toward its frame. Slowly, patiently, until, click, the brass latch settled home. A tiny sound, no louder than the settling of ash, yet wonderfully reassuring. Immediately the room enclosed me once more. The corridor ceased to exist. The unanswered questions remained outside with the ancient house. Within these walls there survived only warmth, only quiet, only the steady companionship of fading embers and rain. The hearth had surrendered almost entirely to ash. Only here and there, beneath the pale grey surface, tiny crimson points still glowed with remarkable persistence, pulsing gently like distant stars glimpsed through winter mist. I crossed to the chair. The wool dressing gown rested comfortably about my shoulders, preserving the warmth gathered from the room. My fingers found the belt without looking. The knot loosened. One sleeve slipped free, then the other. The thick cloth whispered softly as I folded it across the chair exactly where Gibbons had placed it earlier. There was comfort in restoring even so small an order. The room seemed to approve. I turned toward the bed. Its 4 dark posts rose into shadow above me with quiet dignity. The quilts waited exactly as I had left them, their generous folds scarcely disturbed by my brief absence. I folded back the upper edge. The linen beneath felt cool for the briefest instant before surrendering to warmth. Lowering myself carefully, I felt the familiar embrace of the mattress. It accepted my weight without protest. The pillow welcomed my head. The heavy quilt settled gradually across my chest, then my shoulders, enclosing me once again within their quiet gravity. Outside lay the rain. Outside lay hidden corridors. Outside lay tobacco smoke drifting through darkness and candlelight escaping beneath a closed door. Inside remained only the slow breathing of the room. I rested both hands lightly upon the quilt. The observations of the night returned one final time. The muddy smear beside Sir Edmund's study. The delicate lace handkerchief carrying the fragrance of lavender. The sweet trace of Turkish tobacco. The narrow ribbon of candlelight beneath Colonel Ashcombe's door. Each presented itself calmly. Each found its proper place. Then, with equal care, I set them aside. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Merely placed where they could remain undisturbed. A tired mind often mistakes movement for progress. Experience has taught me that even an investigator must occasionally permit his thoughts to become still. An hour. No more. That would suffice. The deep hours of the night possess their own peculiar honesty. If the manor intended to reveal another secret before dawn, I would meet it with clearer senses after a brief surrender to rest. For now, the house could keep its silence. I closed my eyes. My breathing lengthened naturally. A slow breath inward. A slower breath away. The embers answered with a faint settling of ash. The rain continued. Soft upon the roof. Soft against ancient stone. Soft beyond the curtained window. Again. Breath. Rain. Silence. Again. Breath. Rain. Silence. The room seemed warmer with every passing minute. The pillow gentler. The quilts heavier. The last crimson glow upon the hearth gradually withdrew beneath its blanket of grey ash, until only the faintest suggestion of warmth remained. Time loosened its hold. Thought dissolved into sensation. The rain became breathing. The breathing became rain. Nothing hurried. Nothing demanded attention. The manor itself appeared suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Sleep arrived quietly. Not all at once. First as a pleasant heaviness in the limbs. Then as a gentle softening of every sound. Then as the comforting certainty that for a little while the world required nothing further of me. How long I slept I cannot honestly say. Perhaps only minutes. Perhaps rather longer. Then, far below, the grandfather clock began to announce the hour. The first deep chime rolled upward through the sleeping house, softened by ancient timber and long corridors. Before its echo had entirely faded, a sharp report split the immense stillness. Not thunder. Not the wind. Glass. A single pane breaking somewhere below. Almost at once there followed another sound, so faint that I could not be certain whether I had truly heard it. A muffled cry, abruptly cut short. My eyes opened into the darkness. The rain continued exactly as before. But Blackwood Manor no longer slept. My eyes were open before the final echo of the chime had entirely dissolved. For one brief moment I remained exactly where I was, listening. The rain continued upon the roof. The embers upon the hearth had become little more than a soft grey glow beneath their blanket of ash. Nothing within the room had altered. Everything beyond it had. I folded back the quilts. Their familiar weight slipped quietly away as I sat upon the edge of the bed. The room greeted me with cool air. My slippers waited where I had left them. One foot. Then the other. The worn leather received them without complaint. Upon the bedside table rested my little silver torch. My fingers closed gently around its polished body. The metal retained the night's chill. I did not illuminate it. Darkness, once accepted, often proves unexpectedly generous to patient eyes. I crossed the room. The carpet softened every movement. At the door I paused only long enough to rest my hand upon the brass handle. A measured turn. A quiet yielding. The heavy oak opened a few inches. No more. I slipped through. Behind me the latch returned to its place with scarcely a whisper. The upper corridor lay before me exactly as I had left it. Long. Still. Immersed in darkness. Yet the silence had changed. Not in volume. In character. The house no longer seemed asleep. It seemed attentive. Far below, the grandfather clock continued its solemn labor. Tick. Dot dot dot. Tock. Dot dot dot. Tick. Its steady pulse possessed a remarkable indifference to human concerns. Whether secrets remained hidden or revealed, whether danger approached or departed, the old clock acknowledged only the passing of another second. I stood upon the landing. Very slowly I drew a single breath. Then another. The familiar perfumes of Blackwood Manor greeted me at once. Polished oak. Old beeswax. Stone cooled by centuries. The faint memory of extinguished fires. Something was missing. I breathed again. The Turkish tobacco. It had vanished. Not merely faded. Gone. In its place, another presence announced itself. A current of cold air. Fresh. Damp. It rose steadily from the lower floors, carrying with it the unmistakable fragrance of rain-soaked gardens and wet gravel. Outdoor air. Somewhere below, the night had found an entrance. Or an exit. The cool draft wandered gently along the staircase before passing the landing and disappearing into the upper darkness. I watched it without seeing it, observing only the slight movement it encouraged in the edge of a hanging tapestry. Nothing more. The conclusion required no haste. A door had been opened. Or a window. Recently. Very recently. Holding the unlit torch loosely at my side, I began to move. The corridor yielded once more to my slow progress. Each step remained silent upon the thick carpet. The hem of my dressing gown brushed softly against my slippers. Nothing stirred behind the closed bedroom doors. No voice broke the immense stillness. Only the rain persisted. Steady, measured, endless. At length I reached the head of the great staircase. The entrance hall below had become an immense well of darkness. The carved banister descended into blackness before disappearing altogether. Somewhere beneath that darkness waited the study. The stained glass window. The front entrance. Whatever had interrupted the quiet order of the house. I rested one hand upon the polished oak rail. The timber felt cool beneath my fingers. Only then did I raise the torch. For a heartbeat I allowed it to remain dark. Then my thumb found the small switch. A gentle pressure. Click. A narrow circle of pale light awakened. Its beam traveled cautiously downward, touching the banister first before drifting across the steps one by one. Oak. Carpet. Another step. Another. The light continued its patient descent until it reached the stone flags of the entrance hall. There it paused. At first I noticed only scattered points of brightness. Tiny reflections. Cold. Sharp. As the beam steadied, their nature became unmistakable. Glass. Fragments lay strewn across the floor in irregular patterns, each catching the torchlight with the hard brilliance of ice upon a winter path. The great stained glass window beside Sir Edmund's study had been broken. Not outward. Inward. The remaining pieces still clung to the lead framework, while jagged edges surrounded the empty opening through which the rain-cooled night had entered. The draught rising through the manor suddenly required no further explanation. My light moved a little farther. Very slowly. Just beyond the largest scatter of broken glass rested another object. It lay upon the stone floor with the quiet finality of something dropped in haste. A leather glove. Heavy. Dark. Its fingers slightly curled. Mud clung to the seams and creases, not yet dried, leaving small smears upon the flagstones beneath. I allowed the beam to linger. Then it traveled only a little farther. The study door stood open. Not wide. Only by a few careful inches. A narrow strip of darkness separated it from its frame. Nothing moved beyond. The rain continued to murmur through the broken window. The grandfather clock maintained its patient rhythm. And from the head of the staircase, with the pale circle of my torch resting upon shattered glass, a mud-stained glove, and the silent study beyond, I remained perfectly still, listening before taking another step into the sleeping house. For several quiet moments I remained upon the final stair. The beam of my little silver torch rested where it had last fallen. Upon the broken glass. Upon the mud-stained glove. Upon the narrow opening of Sir Edmund's study door. Nothing moved. The rain continued its endless conversation with the manor roof. Soft. Measured. Patient. The cool draught entering through the broken stained glass wandered gently across the entrance hall, before disappearing among the carved balusters of the staircase. It carried the fragrance of wet stone, soaked hedgerows, and distant earth newly washed by the weather. Very slowly I descended the remaining steps. Each one accepted my weight with admirable discretion. The circle of light traveled before me across the flagstones, pausing now and then upon tiny fragments of colored glass. Ruby, amber, deep blue. The broken pieces reflected the torch in miniature, preserving within themselves the colors that had once adorned the great window. I stopped beside the leather glove. It lay precisely where I had first observed it. A gentleman's glove. Substantial. Well made. The mud upon its fingers remained fresh enough to retain a faint sheen beneath the light. I did not disturb it. Certain objects reveal more by remaining untouched than by immediate examination. Instead, I allowed the torch to drift toward the study door. Still ajar. Still silent. I rested one hand against the polished oak. The wood felt cool. With the gentlest pressure, I widened the opening. The hinges answered only with the faintest murmur. Warm light greeted me. Not bright. Merely sufficient. A single candle burned steadily upon Sir Edmund's writing desk, its modest flame enclosed within a shaded brass holder that softened the glow into quiet amber. The room appeared almost exactly as I had left it earlier in the night. The shelves of green leather-bound books stood in orderly ranks. The velvet curtains remained drawn against the weather. The crystal decanter upon its silver tray caught the candlelight with gentle dignity. Only the occupants had changed. Colonel Ashcombe stood beside the desk. His bearing remained as composed as ever, though his coat bore a scattering of fine raindrops that glimmered briefly before disappearing into the dark cloth. In one hand he held a leather-bound portfolio. Its corners were worn smooth with age. Its clasp remained securely fastened. Nearby stood Gibbons. The elderly butler had removed his jacket, revealing immaculate shirt sleeves despite the lateness of the hour. One white cuff carried the smallest trace of dust, while his otherwise perfect composure had acquired only the faintest suggestion of recent exertion. Both gentlemen turned as I entered. Neither appeared surprised. Colonel Ashcombe inclined his head. "I had hoped," he said quietly, "that you might be the one to come through that door." His voice possessed the same measured economy I had noticed earlier. No excitement. No flourish. Merely calm. I extinguished the torch. The study became smaller at once, gathered comfortably around the candle's gentle circle. "I imagine," I replied, "that several observations now require explanation." "They do." The colonel rested the portfolio lightly upon the desk. "It was never my intention to involve Sir Edmund unnecessarily." His fingers lingered for a moment upon the worn leather. "This belonged to his late father." The candlelight revealed faint impressions where generations of hands had opened and closed its cover. "It contains certain family papers of a confidential nature, entirely honorable, entirely private." Gibbons spoke for the first time. "For several weeks, sir, anonymous letters have arrived suggesting that someone outside the family believed those papers to possess considerable value." His quiet voice seemed entirely suited to the hour. "I feared," I said, "that your concern extended beyond misplaced correspondence." The colonel gave a slight nod. "I recognized a gentleman among the recent visitors to the district." He paused. "Not by reputation. By habit." I looked toward him with quiet interest. "The Turkish tobacco." "Precisely." A faint smile touched his otherwise reserved expression. "I have smoked the same blend for many years. Some months ago, I encountered another gentleman who favored it. Unfortunately, he also possessed an unusual curiosity regarding old family records." The fragrance lingering in the eastern corridors suddenly found its proper place. "I remained awake," he continued, "because I suspected someone might attempt precisely what occurred tonight." Gibbons folded his hands before him. "When the household retired, Colonel Ashcombe and I kept watch separately, sir." "The light beneath your door?" The colonel inclined his head again. "My candle." "The drawer?" "I was examining the portfolio to ensure nothing had already been removed." "And the handkerchief?" For the first time, Gibbons permitted himself the smallest expression of embarrassment. "My niece, sir, had visited earlier in the week. She left it behind, and I had absent-mindedly placed it in my pocket while preparing rooms. During our watch, I fear I dropped it upon the staircase without noticing." A simple explanation. Entirely human. Entirely sufficient. Outside, the rain maintained its gentle recital against the stone. Colonel Ashcombe continued. "Shortly after 3 o'clock we heard movement near the study window." He glanced briefly toward the broken stained glass. The fellow had evidently hoped to avoid the corridors altogether. "The glass?" "He lost his nerve," Gibbons answered. "We reached the window just as he attempted to force it, sir. There was a brief struggle over the portfolio." The butler's words remained remarkably restrained. "No shouting. No violence." He relinquished the document and departed rather hastily through the same window. The colonel allowed himself the faintest breath that might almost have become a laugh. In doing so, he neglected both the glove and whatever dignity he previously possessed. For a little while, none of us spoke. The silence required no interruption. The candle burned steadily. the rain answered from beyond the curtains. At length I looked once more toward the leather portfolio resting safely upon the desk. Every observation of the night settled quietly into its proper position. The muddy trace outside the study, the tobacco, the wakeful candle, the open drawer, the glove. Even the broken window had become not the beginning of a tragedy, but the final act of a failed intrusion. The manor had never concealed murder. It had concealed loyalty. I inclined my head. "I believe," I said softly, "that Blackwood Manor may once again enjoy a peaceful night." "I believe so too," replied Colonel Ashcombe. Gibbons looked toward the shattered window. "I shall have the opening boarded at first light," he said after a moment, "but until then, I think the rain itself will discourage any gentleman inclined to repeat the attempt." The three of us stood quietly for another few breaths, listening. Nothing remained beyond the weather. Nothing remained beyond the old house settling comfortably around itself. Satisfied that no further vigilance was presently required, I offered my good night. Colonel Ashcombe returned it with quiet courtesy. Gibbons accompanied me only as far as the study door before remaining behind to tend the room. The room. Once again I crossed the entrance hall. The broken glass glittered softly upon the stone, no longer ominous, merely awaiting careful collection. The staircase welcomed my slow ascent. The grandfather clock continued faithfully below. Tick. ... Tock. ... Tick. The rhythm accompanied me back through the silent corridors until, at length, I reached my room. The brass latch yielded gently beneath my hand. Within, the guest chamber remained wonderfully unchanged. The hearth had surrendered almost entirely to pale ash, though somewhere beneath it a last quiet warmth still lingered. The room felt untouched by all that had passed beyond its walls. I removed the dressing gown, folded it carefully across the chair, then returned to the waiting bed. The linen greeted me once more with familiar smoothness. The heavy quilt settled gradually across my chest. Warm, comfortable, entirely sufficient. From the bedside table I picked up my silver pocket watch. The polished case felt pleasantly cool. I opened it. The slender hands continued their patient progress through the deep hours of the night. The quiet ticking seemed curiously companionable now. Not a reminder of passing time. Merely a steady assurance that each peaceful moment would naturally yield to the next. I closed the watch, placed it beside the bed, then allowed my hands to rest quietly upon the quilt. Outside, the rain continued without interruption. Soft upon the slate roof, soft against the ancient stone, soft across the sleeping gardens. The sound enclosed the manor like a gentle promise. Within those old walls, every door now stood secure. Every secret that needed preserving had been preserved. Every faithful heart had remained faithful. The embers faded gently beneath their veil of ash. The rain sang on through the darkness. My breathing found its quiet rhythm once again. And wrapped safely within the warm stillness of Blackwood Manor, while the patient weather kept its endless watch beyond the windows, I surrendered without effort to the peaceful remainder of the night, carried onward by the comforting music of the rain, until even the last whisper of wakefulness quietly slipped away.